Thank you so much, Ree. And it's great to be here with Deanne. I think Deanne and I go quite a long time back. Actually, sort of started around the time where when QIL came out and the Queen Young Leaders identified basically, I think, two of us for working on very similar, the same causes in the 2 years. So we were like, and we're both in the same city, so we must connect. And then since then, I think Deanne started attending some of our very first events as well at MENA, coming on the ground, and we've been trying to collaborate ever since. So I have been involved in working in urban slum communities, particularly in Mumbai now for the last, it's crazy, it's like 10 years now. And over the last 10 years, I think we've really gotten to build a lot of community trust and get on board a lot of slum community leaders. And it's with them, with whom we founded the organization MENA Mahila Foundation many years later in 2015, with really the mission to provide women with more agency and control over their lives. So we through the number of years of working there, it became very obvious after watching lots of stories on the ground and hearing about just how women sort of felt helpless, and were giving in to a lot of societal norms and pressures and structural barriers that they experienced to really get out of their bubble. And so we tried very hard initially to try to understand how is it that we can really get women to start recognizing that there's a new norm for themselves. And it came down to something that was very tangible and manageable to tackle at face value, but could go a long way. And when we started brainstorming in sessions and groups, what should we really be doing that empowers women? Women themselves said that it's when we can see the tangible output of a product that we have made, we feel proud of it. It's like cooking food at home. We feel proud of cooking food at home because we can actually see the output. Similarly, we want to do the same here. And sanitary napkins actually was something that they themselves suggested in conversations, being like, this is actually if we start to make these napkins, we will feel proud of something that we have made. And the napkins can go a long way in our communities, because if other women don't have access to them, we can be providing this to them as well, making this a lot more than just providing it one-on-one. It actually has these cascading movement effects in the community that can create behavior change as well. So that was the genesis of how, I guess, menstrual hygiene became a really big component of the concept of agency for providing women, which is our overarching theme. And over the years, we've been providing now support to more than 500,000 women at the doorstep in urban slum communities. We've now gone on to collaborating with lots of other institutions and organizations and other geographical areas, even in tribal communities, trying to provide menstrual hygiene awareness education sessions now for both boys and girls and women and men. Also for providing products, access to them, where we are a social enterprise. So we also manufacture and we sell these products. We're also manufacturing and selling menstrual maternity products as well for hospitals, and also running a few employment campaigns and running life skill sessions as well. One of the more blatant things that we do that I just mentioned quickly around the Menstrual Hygiene Day coming up is a pad parade, which is basically where we are essentially getting women, usually on the streets, on microphones, talking about how period blood is not bad blood. And now we're trying to do the same online, unfortunately, but I think hopefully it has similar effects. But yeah, so that's on me, and Deanne would love to hear more about you and how you started Red is the New Green.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, just to begin with, hi everyone, I'm Deanne, and I started Red is the New Green really by accident. I would say I was working in my office and I got my period very unexpectedly. And I'm sure this is something which has happened to almost everyone here and anyone who gets their period. You know, sometimes you just do not plan for it or you do not know what's going on. So I got my period and like everyone who has it, I was just lost and confused. I didn't know what to do. So I just went to the chemist nearby. I picked up sanitary napkins and I was able to go on with the rest of my day. But that really, for once, put me out of my bubble of privilege because, you know, for us, it's so easy, right? We can just go down, use our card, and get pads. But for so many others, the entire day was, or their life could be disrupted, or they could miss out a big opportunity because of something as normal as menstrual hygiene and periods, which is a normal body process. So that really got me thinking about it. And wondering what to do and how I could help in my own way. So I realized I myself knew very little about periods, and I did more research. And my company, in fact, then gave me initial funding to start Red is the New Green. And our basic tenets were very simple. We, number one, wanted to create access and awareness about periods. The main point of talking openly about periods is something we wanted to focus on. And also, not only that, but we also focus on creating access and creating ways where we can focus on menstrual waste management. That's a huge problem in our country. I'm sure, and Suhani would also tell you that menstrual waste is something that is a looming issue not only in India, in also other countries as well. So that's something we're also trying to tackle through Red is the New Green, and we mostly work with schools, villages, and all these aspects where we try to educate people. And so I'd request, if it's possible, can we do a bit of an interaction, and maybe can we start with you? If you'd like to share how your first period experience was, and how was that like growing up in the UK? Did they talk about train you guys about periods, or how did that go for you?
No problem. So so in the UK, it's part of the national curriculum. So they teach, but I'm trying to remember how they did it. Seems so long ago now. I feel really old. But I think they split boys and girls when they were talking about sex ed, and that meant that girls understood what was going to happen to their bodies, but boys didn't necessarily understand what was happening to their classmates at the same time. As you got older, sex education then became much more around kind of reproductive systems and understanding the biology of it. There was very little that kind of talked around the emotional changes that women go through, the hormonal changes, and what that means beyond just kind of growing up and hitting puberty is a really scientific problem. For me personally, I was quite old. I must have been, I was 15, I think, nearly 16 before I had my first period. And I remember being really freaked out about it because all of my friends had started, and I was like, oh my God, I'm so weird. Why has this not happened to me yet? So I had friends who started when they were 11, 12, and I was kind of hitting old teenage years and was like, what is happening? But at least by that point, I'd gone through that educational process. I'd spoken to my mum a lot about it. My dad was a bit more traditional. He wouldn't necessarily have had that conversation with me as openly as he might do now, or as maybe like my boyfriend would with our daughters if we had them in the future. Because I think maybe just slightly different times, slightly different generations. But I'd spoken to my mum about it, and she was like, you're not weird, it's fine. And then it happened, and ever since that day, it's been once a month you wake up and you're like, oh, here we go again. Why did I ever complain about this in the first place? So yeah, so it was good. It wasn't really a negative experience beyond that self-imposed pressure that I put on myself, and this idea that I should be at a certain point, or I should have started at a certain time. And obviously we're very lucky in the UK that we have very open and available access to excellent sanitary products. They are taxed in the UK though. They're considered a luxury, which for many women and many people in the UK is unbelievable, given that it is a biological need, and we require this, and this happens. This isn't something that I think any woman would class as a luxury. It's an absolute necessity. But beyond that, we are in a very privileged and very lucky position that for a lot of us, it is possible to access the materials we need when we need them. That being said, period poverty has become a really important topic in the UK, and our government's recently announced that I think all schools across England, Wales and Scotland will now have access to free period pads and free tampons for students, so that those who either come from backgrounds that cannot sustain it, or cannot provide the tampons or the sanitary pads that young girls need at that time, are still able to go into school and are able to get them, which is a really, really positive step. And a lot of that has come out of lobbying from youth groups here in the UK, which has been really, really good. There's a really great campaign called The Bloody Good Period, which is led by a young woman here in the UK, and I think they've worked really, really hard to push for legislative change, if I can say the word, and that's been really, really positive, and means that even more young girls will now be able to kind of enter womanhood, or however they want to see it, in a way that is supported, is safe, and is hygienic as much as possible, particularly when they spend most of their time in school, and if home isn't a particularly safe place for them.
Is this the campaign that's led by Amika George?
I believe so, yeah, exactly.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I think the UK is doing a lot, and Australia as well, I think, just went through this process of, I mean, there they have a lot of awareness already generated around this topic, but in the New Victoria region, I think they've completely now they've crafted a whole new set of policies just for menstrual hygiene management in schools, and across all schools everywhere they're providing free products as well, completely like an experiment for them. But even there, they recognize this to be a problem. It's crazy how I think the developed world is now crafting some of these policies that I think would serve as a foundation, hopefully, for the other emerging markets to follow. I think in India as well, we had such a policy put in place, but it's been really massively, I think, just gone haywire on the ground because the enforcement is so poor, and the quality of napkins provided in schools in an attempt to keep them cheap is really, really bad. I think I'll talk about my first period experience as well, and then I want to hear from also some of the other participants here. So I actually got my first period in 7th grade when I was on a school trip. And I had never learned about sanitary napkins or ever learned about what a period even was. So I actually freaked out. And this was actually when we had gone on this school trip to visit various temples in northern India, in Himachal Pradesh. So this was basically where I had to tell my teachers that I actually am bleeding and there's something wrong with me. And then they were like, oh, okay, this is actually your period, and that you must not now enter the temples, and you cannot now enter and like go anywhere. Whereas if I would have known about this in advance, I probably would never have told them that I had my periods and then gone anyway. But because now they knew, they kept me out. And then they also announced to the whole group of girls, calling everybody aside and telling everyone that whoever has periods right now, stay outside with Suhani. And all of us were like, we were all really confused. We thought maybe this is just like a rule, or maybe this is like something that we must follow. We like, why didn't we know about this? And we would discuss with each other. We like Googled all this when we were like waiting outside. There were 3 of us girls. And then we realized this is like some sort of like a taboo, and that we were being now like targeted, and we felt like victims. And so we actually like spoke up about this, and we were like, wait. Once again, what are you doing to us again? Because we realized this is not actually a rule. Like it doesn't state this anywhere. We checked all around the temple. Like there's nothing that states this. And we just see this online, that it seems like actually this is an Orthodox tradition, and that you're actually imposing this on us. And we're like from a Mumbai school where like, we're highly educated, you're educated, like everything is fine. But why are you behaving like this? And I called up my mom, and my mom was like, yeah, actually people say this, but like go inside the temple. Like break the norm, okay? And so when she told me this too, we were like, okay, we're just gonna go anyway. I don't care if the teachers scream at us. And actually the teachers did not speak to us for a few days after that too, but just because we were like, I mean, we don't test to this. So I think that was my first experience. It started with advocacy, but my mom, when I came home, she was so shy even then to talk to me about it. My dad actually did. He sat me down and he was like, Beta, now you're going to have to like make sure that you buy sanitary napkins in advance and this and that. And my mom was like, oh my God, this is now going to be like so embarrassing that he's teaching her this. And then I think slowly once MENA started, mom also became a lot more comfortable to talk about this and was like, okay, now I cannot not like hide behind this. But I think this is like such a like ingrained norm, no matter where you are in society.
So I just wanted to say, I think that's really important, Suhani, the fact that you highlighted your story and also about the stigmas and, a couple of things which are some very unique and very peculiar to India, and some which are more so prevalent across the world. So, another thing I want to share is that, all of us enjoy sushi a lot. I particularly, for one, really like sushi. And a friend of mine, from Japan told me that the chefs who make it are mostly male. If you see, it's mostly a male thing, and they don't prefer women, or they don't allow women. Traditionally, women were not allowed to make sushi because it was said that the body temperature of women changes very drastically on your period, and as a result, that body heat may corrupt or may spoil the fish. And they just did not allow women to get into these professions. So a big learning for me through Red is the New Green. I primarily came with a lot of misinformation. I thought this was again a very Indian context and a very Indian sort of problem, but I realized that it's vastly global. And shame and stigma is something that is not, just here. It's across, and it's manifested in different ways. In some parts of India, very widely, like in South India, but in the northern sides or towards the east, it's also very highly stigmatized. And there are cases near Nepal where girls are made to stay in huts outside their homes, and often that causes very severe health infections and diseases. It has also resulted in death.
I know how much kind of stigma is associated, particularly what you were just saying there, Deanne, just these ideas and these kind of old housewives tales, these old myths that, you know, women can't do certain things at a certain time, or they're unclean at a certain time, or this means they can't pray properly at a certain time. All of these surrounding stories, where do they come from, and how do you guys both go about helping to smash those myths and helping people see the realities?
So I think in some of the work that we do in the slums, we are coming across a variety of different religions as well. And a lot of this we found is, I mean, there's cultural components, and then there are also religious components. And the religious components are particularly dangerous and risky to tackle, because people often think it's an attack on their religion. So one of our first learnings was that we should have a same religion trainer as the participants. So when we started working with primarily Muslim participants, and we had a Muslim trainer come in so that they could relate and that it didn't seem like an attack. And then we started to actually ensure that our training programs had very clearly, like they included components from the holy books. That doesn't, so because often the answers that we can anticipate, you know, based on the first few sessions, that no, but like this is what the Quran says, or this is what the Bible says, and this is what we should be following, and then actually having an answer to that actually this is what it states. You can interpret this in this way, but like this is what it actually just states, and lots of people have actually no idea that it actually just states that. And then also talking about facts and not telling them how they should think, just telling them the facts. So like just telling them, so for instance, when women are being kept out of temples, for instance, or when women are told don't touch pickles because it'll go bad if you're on your periods, essentially giving them facts as to why it wasn't good to touch a pickle, or why it wasn't good for women to make pickles, because it was such an arduous process, and that also pickles generate heat inside the body, where again, as Deanne explained, your body temperature goes up, so hence you should not be consuming pickles. Now they can interpret it however they'd like, but they now know the reality as to why this came about. And we felt that makes a woman think that she has more decision-making power. She feels like she's targeted less, and it opens up her mind to start actually like just analytically thinking about the situation more. We've also found that younger girls are a lot more perceptive and a lot more willing to change their ideas than their mothers are. But if the mother and the daughters are together, it also creates more impact, because the daughters are explaining to the mother, like, or nudging them on spot, and then the mothers actually come up to us and they start apologizing to us, being like, you know, we have not been able to teach our daughters what you have just taught us, so we wish that we actually had. So I think we've had a lot of learnings, but I think we realized we want to be less attacking, less drastic, less blatant, and more understanding of their cultural norms and going by that. Deanne, what has your experience been in schools?
So I think, Suhani, I agree with you. You know, the fact of the less attacking approach is definitely very important, because as women, they're always subjected to, you know, you should do this, you should do that. And you know, I really like the approach where you give them their space, give them and empower them to make their decisions. So if there's something that they're not comfortable with, it's all right. It's entirely up to them, as long as they have access to fair information. So I'll give you an example, and I'll take on a topic which is cloth pads. Okay, and cloth pads are something which is sometimes controversial, because sometimes particular media paints India as a really, you know, really backward nation. everyone, and they quote really old and outdated studies where say women now 88%. Suhani, correct me if I've got the stats. I think it's 88%, which went like really viral. They were like, very few women in India don't have access to
AC
sanitary
Nielsen
napkins.
study.
Yeah. Okay, so it was a really, really old study, and the sample set was again really small, but this was the only piece of data. Yeah, 1200. And it was
in a village in
sensationalized.
Rajasthan. Yeah, in a village in Rajasthan, and they were like, this is the national statistic. And BBC, UNICEF, everybody quoted it, including the Bollywood movie too, which made it really big, Bad Man.
And this study released in 2011, and right up till 2017, as late as that, people were quoting it like this is the current situation. So to give you a gist of what that study said, it said that very few women in India have access to sanitary napkins, and it's so unhygienic. They're using ash, and they're using hay, they're using like twigs, and they're using really bad cloth. And it painted India in a really bad light. Like, nobody knew what periods were and all of that. And the thing is, when we did more research or when we spoke with more people, it really wasn't so. To give you some context, before sanitary napkins came into India, India had economic liberalization in the 90s. And that's really when most of these big brands and all of it. So like late 80s, early 90s, sanitary napkins became really popular. And, while the more affluent started purchasing it, then because of economies of scale and because they could produce more, that's how the adoption towards sanitary napkins took place. But earlier, for generation like Suhani's grandmom, my grandmom, and so many generations before that, they used cloth. And the way they use cloth is, in India, many women wear saris, and most of them are good cotton products. So they would use these old cloths, wash them well, fold it up, use it as a sanitary pad, and then dry it out in the sun. And the main thing is that when cloth pads are washed properly, and the sun is a natural disinfectant, these cloths are really good to go. They're good to reuse, and it's absolutely a good way to manage your period if done in a correct way, in a hygienic manner. Often what happens is, in many places, they don't have access to a very open courtyard or a place to dry it. Many urban slums are very packed. Sometimes there are multiple layers. It's not very well lit. And also because of the stigma and which women use for their periods, these cloths don't end up being dried in the sun. It's often dried in a damp place, and that is the reason why women who use these methods are maybe prone to infections. And while they may start off really small, like itching, but they have very serious ramifications if continued for a long period of time. So that's what I wanted to talk about. When people say cloth pad, even Suhani's organization, I know they do this as well. They educate people about the pros and cons of both aspects. If you're using a cloth pad, these are correct ways to use it. If you're using a disposable sanitary napkins, these are ways you can dispose it correctly. And then the point is to leave that and to give the woman or give the girl that agency, saying whatever you're comfortable with now that you have this knowledge, it's up to you. So we let them make that final choice. So, that's something I wanted to highlight about, how education can also be used to empower and really give them that space to share their views.
Right. And Dian, while you're talking about this, I know that, we're both running menstrual hygiene organizations in the same city, working in similar areas as well. And then there are hundreds of other menstrual hygiene-based organizations, even within the state of Maharashtra where we are, and then also all over the country, and then all over the world. What do you think about everyone sort of coexisting and being a part of the same ecosystem versus competing with one another? Or how do you really think the dynamics work here? And is there really space for all of us?
Sure. So I think, that's something Suhani and me really bonded over, is that in the menstrual hygiene space or in any sort of leadership aspect, it's always important to back each other up. And competition will only get you so far. When you collaborate, you really have a wider reach. You really learn so much more. And I feel like that's a really important takeaway. I think both of us saw a lot of it in our respective QIL experiences. Definitely. various fields, I feel like that really showed us the strength which exists when young people come together. When we leave our insecurities or our fears behind, and we're just like, you know what, we're working together. The cause is way more important than you and me and our really great ideas. So let's share. And I feel like that's really good because I know that, we got each other's back and we pass on opportunities. In fact, like, if we need sanitary napkins to be procured, we'd call up Sohani, or if they need something, we're always there to support, and we have that mindset. And I feel like this is something which should be built across the world. It is, unfortunately, I'd be lying if I say that everyone is like this. It's very rare. It's not a very common occurrence. We've seen right from big corporates to mid-size to across the chain, where people are so scared of being taken over or scared of someone taking their one great idea. I always feel like if you have an idea, there are so many more from where that came from. There's always more merit in sharing. There's always merit in coming together, which is why both of us were so excited to do this. We both work in the same space. We have pretty similar work, and people always say, guys, do you all know of each other? Do you all know what these people are doing? And we're like, yeah, hell, we've helped them out or they've helped us. So it's really nice and we really want to bring that across at QCT as well. And it's good to have a community, good to always fall back and to know that, hey, at the end of a tough day, we have a big challenge. I know I can call Suhani and be like, do you know what that organization did? Or do you know how tough it is to work in the field? That's your ally, that's your community, and that's how you can work together to make some difference in the world.
We've definitely seen that highlighted also during COVID now that we've seen a lot of our regular activities be paused. And that now when we need to be actually getting our networks within the communities and being like, well, okay, we need to really be joining forces and hands and being like, what do you have to provide right now? What do we need? And how can we make sure that we build those connections? I think this also highlights how in regular times, we actually need to be building these connections stronger to help in such crisis times as well, as this has really helped us.
So coming to COVID, Suhani, coming to the recent pandemic and how it's completely shook the world, do you want to tell us and shed a little more light on MENA's 8-point plan and the wonderful work you guys are doing, not only with addressing the period and getting people access to products, but also really taking care of the community and their health? Can you just tell us a little more about it?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for asking. So MENA sort of had to pause a lot of its regular menstrual hygiene-based activities on the ground. And because we have access to a lot of this urban slum community networks, which are completely sealed off right now for even by essentially anybody except the police. Only the police comes in and out of those communities now because of the number of cases that have been rising. And the Govandi M East ward area of the city of Mumbai is basically now become almost the biggest hotspot in the city and thereby in the country, because Mumbai is the fastest growing rate of cases in the country right now. So we realized that we had a huge responsibility now to be able to connect government to people within the slums to the extent that we could. So as part of our 8-point plan, we basically started to provide the first and most important thing that people recognized was a need for them, which is ration. So providing food and ration to them along with sanitary napkins and face masks and other just sanitary materials that they need. Sometimes they wanted hand sanitizers as well, hand soap, because many of them actually don't have any access to hand soap. They normally also never had it at home. Then the second thing that we did was we converted our regular line that we were our contact number to be a women's helpline, and this is where we were receiving, and we are still receiving, unfortunately, many domestic violence and sexual assault cases on call, where we are essentially trying to connect each of them to the local municipal corporation and or to local NGOs that can help tackle them. As referral cases. The third thing that we are doing is repurposing a sanitary napkin facility to be a face mask manufacturing facility. So we've been manufacturing face masks now and then distributing this door to door in communities, and from even to the police officers. In fact, it's so crazy that they also don't have access to these products right now. Even the local health providers that have shut off their businesses, we've gone to them and tried to provide them with the PPE that they need so they can start their businesses and see many of the cases that they're not able to see right now. Then we are at point 4 doing disease surveillance in slums. So this is where we are able to talk to the informal health providers, understanding from them the types of cases that they're getting, from the pharmacies where we leave our sanitary napkins as well. Actually, in fact, it's again crazy that no other company has been providing them with sanitary napkins. So only MENA pads are currently available in those chemist shops in these local slum areas. So we are also in conversation with them to get to know the kinds of cases that are coming to them and the types of medicines that people have been asking for fever, cold, cough, to try to provide this upward information about where the hot pockets actually can be. Cases, so people are not revealing their cases. So we are calling each of our beneficiaries up on call, where we are understanding from them their symptoms and understanding whether whether they know of positive cases in their neighborhood, to try to just map out where the cases might actually be. Then we're providing COVID sensitization as well on call. So we're providing them with information about what they should be doing on a regular basis. We're also sending them SMS notifications 2 times a day with the needed information. We are providing webinars now online. So most of the information that we used to do in person, we're providing through Zoom calls and Instagram live chats. And we've just started our MENA Mahila Health app, which is basically a way to digitally connect all of our women that we were, through our Sponsor a Girl programs, where these are particularly vulnerable women who we were providing menstrual hygiene education to, but they need to be connected somehow now. So they're provided with videos that they can just stream on the app, and they can provide us with any queries, information they have, chat with us if they need a particular counseling or advice about some matter regarding their health as well. And we've also started to do some research along with, so I'm currently also doing my PhD at Stanford. And so here I've basically been able to receive some funding here to be able to conduct research on the ground regarding COVID stigma. And in fact, the reason why this is also really interesting to tackle is because it very clearly relates to the sanitary napkin and menstrual hygiene stigma as well, which is that we stopped tackling the issue because of the stigma around it, and we try to hide it. And that's precisely what's creating a problem with COVID as well. And it just sort of goes to highlight how this is the same concept, same phenomena that has been happening for such a long time for menstrual hygiene. But unfortunately, because it's an only women problem, it tends to be even more under the rug and even less concentrated on. Whereas with COVID, because it's a general population thing, it's actually, we're able to get a lot more traction for it, and a lot more people are interested in talking about it. And this is one excuse, I guess, for us to be able to tackle stigma about other topics as well in the community, while this is not just a women-only problem. So yeah, that's some of the work that we've been doing here.
I loved how you were like, we've got an 8-point plan, and then just rattles off an insane amount of work that you and the MENA team have been doing. How are you finding that as a young founder with your team over in India, and you're in America? How are you managing that? And are you missing being in India? I know it's such a tough time and crazy time, but it seems like they're doing so well over there, and you're having to still work with a huge amount of people to kind of keep all of this moving and keep the conversation going, and make sure the people who need it are getting the resources from you guys as much as possible.
This has been a test for us. We at first really were not sure how we would do this, but in fact we are working harder than ever. We've expanded our team. We have more people now on board, not because we have more money, we don't, but just because we realize that there's so much more work to be done, and that the team is now really supporting one another virtually to the extent that they can. And our field team has really been amazing, that they have themselves been like, Sahani, we need to reach out to these 700 more families here. We have this 1,000 more families here. Like, they themselves finding these families, and they're like, we have to do something. And then so then just as a team, we start brainstorming what can we do and how can we make this work. It also to some extent helps that I have always, for most of the time, MENA has been around now for 5 years. For almost 3.5 of those years, I've been managing it remotely. So this wasn't new necessarily for me, although it's been tough knowing that I have no idea when I'm going to go back to Mumbai at all. And I've been away now for almost 5 or 6 months. And so I think it's just now like, and even when I do go back, the slums are likely to open up much, much later. So it's likely that our field team who lives in the same slums are likely to be the only ones being able to provide the direct response for some time, at least for a few more months. So there's a lot of actually burden on them. And now, in fact, we've had one COVID positive case, and one of their husbands also has it. And so now we're starting to quarantine basically now our own team, and it's making things a lot more challenging now as things really spread. But I think like we still have such a great group of people on the ground. And then again, as like, you know, with people like Deanne, we have such great partners that we feel like there are enough hands on deck and that we are able to provide support. It's also, this is a time where we're actually finding other people that are leaving the corporate world now, realizing for the first time that the NGO sector in India is actually respectful, and that, you know, more and more people should be working here because the direct relief response is entirely being provided right now by NGOs all over the country. So with this, actually, we've gotten good talent wanting to work with us. For the first time, people are calling us up and being like, hey, do you actually need people, not just to volunteer, but to work with you guys? And I'm like, oh my God, yes. And now people actually want to leave their full-time jobs and work in an NGO full-time for a cause they really believe about, just because they realize this time has made them realize how important that is. So I think that's another way in which we're actually getting support now, which is why we've been able to hire more people as well. But Deanne, we were also asking when I think you froze, was that just that how is Red is the New Green adapting to the COVID situation and the type of relief work that you're doing as well, which has been immense?
So basically, when the pandemic started, we were in the middle of a project, and we had a lot of assignments lined up, a lot of engagements, a lot of face-to-face, and most of them were like in person. We had trainers on board, and obviously when the pandemic happened, all movement was stopped, all physical thing was completely stopped. So we took some time to really think and really figure out what we could do to help, and how we as an organization, we have a small team as well, we were able to bring everyone together. So we started carrying a lot of demand. So people would ask us for sanitary napkin demand aspect, because many organizations at this point do not have the bandwidth because of COVID relief. And like Suhani said, they're frontlining all of the COVID relief in the country. They don't have the timing to say, okay, I'll get maybe X amount of pads, and maybe I'll go with this vendor, or maybe I don't. They just simply do not have the bandwidth. So what we do is we make life really simple for them. Behalf, we number one get the sanitary napkins, make sure they're donated, make sure they're distributed. We also get funding to get those. So that's how we started, and we strictly stayed out of doing food rations, support organizations who are already doing rations, and learning experience. We've seen all sorts of cases where we've seen sanitary napkins sometimes being sold in the black market because no one knows there are big pricing wars, or no one knows where people, we give it to an organization and they just keep it in there because they don't know when they're going to get pads again.
I thought it's a really interesting point around not getting involved with things like food delivery, for example, because there are so many other partners on the ground who are doing that, and it's really important to not necessarily overload yourselves as young founders and as people with small and growing organizations with things that you can't take on in addition to what you yourself are there and what you can help do easily, I guess.
Yep. No, completely agree with that as well. I think, there's strategic decisions that we've all sort of had to make, and also now becoming more and more challenging with the quarantining for like further complicating things in slums. It's just that, we have to try to figure out more in-person relief work that we can do, which is not necessarily the most impactful, but probably is just what makes sense now for the teams.
Given the increased reliance on kind of digital communications, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that in slums, kind of fast Wi-Fi and having connections to the internet or a smartphone or anything that is what we rely on for digital communication so easily, particularly here in the West, is not something that is as readily available. And that feels like it could have consequences for kind of future help and future education for people who live in these conditions in the future, even once COVID is lifted. You've already mentioned that slums will probably be the slowest to come out of lockdown. They're the ones that are going to get hit the hardest by a lot of these measures. So given the reliance on digital, how can we make that easier for these people to be able to access the information and the resources they need?
Yeah, actually, it's surprising that India has done a lot better than most other emerging markets when it comes to the internet and smartphone access and phones in general. So, in fact, I think I mean, we've had some of the cheapest phone data plans probably in the world. And so, because it's so cheap to get it and so cheap to get even a regular, very basic smartphone, that almost every second family has it. So in fact, it's actually very prevalent. So we've done surveys to figure this out as well. There are some national level surveys as well that people have done. We have a smartphone penetration rate of more than 75% as well in just the urban slums that we're looking at. And in each house, you could even have more than one smartphone now. So there are, and internet is again, like, it's not really much of a problem. It's only a problem in some like very, very remote areas and some slum communities, but it's not actually generally a problem. So you can do a lot of, but this I think is a fact that is less understood and less used, I think, still by people. So there's a lot more targeting that we can do with urban slum populations, with providing them smartphone-based solutions, which I think we've just not utilized enough. So that's one. Second is there are a lot of now platforms that use just basic the non-smartphones, the dumb phones as well, that you can provide information through. So whether this is through the interactive voice recording systems, the IVRS, so you can just give them a call and then there's an audio recording playing of the awareness that you want to provide to them. Or it's an SMS that you can send to them that they can SMS back to you about like information that they might need, and then you can call them back, providing them with that information. Then there's also some, and then there's SMS, and then there's information that you can be providing through gaming, and like people have been essentially using some like smartphone-based game apps or so that can essentially help the person themselves understand and access this information, digest it more easily. Language becomes a barrier when you have slum communities because people are traveling from and coming from all over the country with different languages and different cultures. So just providing them in Hindi, that's their national language, or just providing them in Marathi, the local language, is not sufficient to reach everybody. So in that case, using more pictures and animated videos have become more and more popular. We've also tried as much as we can to provide our videos in as many languages as we can in the app, so that people can access the information in the way they need as well. So I actually think that we can be a lot more optimistic about digitizing things and how the people will actually be able to access it, because India has done a really good job of that in the last few years. And the government, I think this is the one thing that they have probably really harped on and done very well.
Deanne, we're literally at time, but if you can hear us, I want to bring you in for any closing statements and anything else that you want to say before we say goodbye.
I'd really like to conclude by saying that we need to get together to share solutions about menstruation, in terms of right from a policy level to understanding it as on a very human, very empathetic thing as well. So I'm glad that we got the conversation rolling today, and I really look forward to more share stories. Like, it was so nice for you read our first time stories. It was really nice to feel a sense of community, and also the fact that there's so much to do. And this is really inspiring because we all have our work cut out and we can all go back and do it in our way, but it's nice we can work together. So I think that's it from me, and so thank you so much for your time. Thank you all for staying tuned and tuning into us.
It's really nice to see the incredible work that everyone's doing, and great to connect with everyone here. Thank you so much.